Okay, now that we know what objects are, how to write classes and use them, I want to talk about constructor methods in this lecture. This is something that will be very useful in our code. And basically, a constructor method is a normal method that gets executed automatically every time we create an object. So, for example, in here you can see that on this line we're creating a new object and we're storing its reference in a variable called myKeylogger. Now, if we are using a constructor method in our code, in our class, then this method will be executed when we create the object. As you remember, if I comment this line and go down and run my program, you'll see that nothing happens at all. But if we implemented a constructor method, then the code in that constructor method will be executed automatically without us calling it. So you can see we had to call the start in order to call the start method. But if we have a constructor, the constructor will be called automatically when we create the object that's based on this class. Now, in order to create a constructor method, we have to define it using the def keyword just like any other method. And then we're going to type the name of the constructor method. And all constructor methods should be called the same name, which is underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And you can see that PyCharm is automatically suggesting that for me. So if I hit enter, it will autofill for me. And then any code that I'm going to put inside this method will be executed automatically when we create the object. So just as a quick example, if I just print, we are in constructor method. Now if I save this, and keep in mind the code in here is still the same, all we're doing is literally just creating the object. But if I go down and run my program, you'll see that our print statement is getting executed automatically, which means that whatever code that I'm gonna put in here inside the init will be executed automatically whenever the object is created. So this is a great place for us to define variables that we're gonna use throughout the program. So it's something similar to the log variable that we're using in here. So I'm going to cut this variable and I'm going to define it in here inside my constructor. And I'm going to say self.log is equal to nothing. So what I'm doing right here is you can think of this something similar to a variable, but it's actually going to be called an attribute because it's a variable that we can use within this whole class and it's actually going to be used in multiple methods. Note the self in here is used so that we're saying that we're actually using a variable that is defined and gonna be used within the current Keylogger class. Now, because this variable is an attribute of this class, we're actually not gonna need to use the global keyword every time we need to use this variable. So I'm gonna remove that from here. I'm gonna remove that from here. And what I'm actually gonna do is you can see that every time we're using the log, we're only appending or adding stuff to this variable. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new method and let's call this append to log. And again, you can see that PyCharm automatically fills the cell for me. And the next thing that I want to take as an argument is the string that we want to append. And what this method is going to do, it's going to do self.log. So again, I'm accessing the attribute, the self.log variable that's used within this whole class. And I'm going to make this equal to self.log plus the string that has been passed. The reason why I created this method is because most of the time when we're using the log, all we're doing is we're appending stuff to this variable. So in here, our try, instead of doing log is equal to log plus this character, all we're gonna say is self.append to log, and what we're gonna pass is the string of the key.character. So it's exactly what we're doing in here, but done nicely. And then what I'm gonna do in here, I'm actually gonna use a local variable. So it's a variable that's only used within this method. And I'm gonna call this current key. And we're gonna make that equal to the key, to the character that has been pressed. And then we're gonna do this here when there is a special character. Again, we're gonna say the current key is equal to space if that key is a space. And then if it's a special key, then the current key is gonna be a space plus the special key. And then at the end of this method, we're gonna say self.append to log, and what we want to append is the current key. And finally, in my report in here, I'm resetting the value of the log. So I can't just say log is equal to nothing, because that's basically we're defining a new variable called log and we're setting it to equal to an empty string. If I want to reset the attribute log that we defined in here, I have to say self.log is equal to nothing, and when I'm printing it, I have to print the self.log. Now this is it. As you can see, we're not using any global variables anymore, and instead we're using a constructor that gets executed every time we create a new object. Inside this constructor, we're creating an attribute called log, which is a variable that will be used throughout our program, and every time we need to use it, we're going to refer to it as self.log. Other than that, our code pretty much stayed the same, other than some refactoring in here that just makes the code prettier and easier to understand. Now let's go and run a quick test. Oh, and I've commented, I'm actually going to remove this print statement, and I've commented the line that starts my code, or that starts my keylogger. So we're going to run it like this. As you can see, there is nothing right now. And if we type this is a test, that is being printed, so everything is fine. The next print should be empty and perfect. And now let's do another test. And that's perfect. Everything is working as expected. And now our code is much better than it used to be. Now in the next lecture, we're gonna polish this code a little bit more, and we'll add the sendMail function to it so that it's a complete and usable keylogger.